The scars carved into the wild horse's white coat made Jack's combat wounds throb with phantom pain, a brutal reminder of captivity that no living creature deserved. The moment their eyes met across the clearing, the veteran recognized what had frightened him most wasn't the horse's aggression, but the haunting reflection of his own trauma staring back from those dark, desperate eyes. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The morning air hung crisp and still over the Montana wilderness as Jack Reynolds trudged along the worn hiking path. At 58, his body carried the weight of his years in the military, 3 tours in Afghanistan that had left him with a slight limp, and memories that still visited him in the darkest hours of the night. His weathered face, lined with experience, remained stoic beneath the rim of his worn straw hat. 20 years after returning home, he still walked with the deliberate pace of a man who'd learned to scan for danger with each step. Jack had moved to this remote stretch of land 5 years ago, trading the chaos of city life for the predictable rhythms of nature. His modest cabin sat nestled against the eastern edge of his property, overlooking rolling grasslands that stretched toward distant mountains. Here, he found the space to breathe, to exist without the constant state of hypervigilance that had followed him home from war. This morning's hike was part of his routine, a 6-mile loop that took him along the border of his land and the adjacent wilderness area. The familiar route helped quiet his mind, the repetitive motion of walking serving as a form of meditation. But today, something felt different. A sensation he couldn't quite place tugged at his instincts, the same awareness that had kept him alive in combat zones. "Something's not right," he muttered to himself, pausing to scan the horizon. Nothing seemed out of place at first glance. The golden grassland swayed gently in the breeze, and the line of pine trees stood sentinel at the edge of the forest. But then he caught it, a flash of white against the dark bark of an old oak that stood isolated in the field, about half a mile off his usual path. Curiosity piqued, Jack altered his course. As he drew closer, the shape became clearer. An animal large and pale against the tree. A horse. The realization quickened his pace. Wild horses weren't uncommon in these parts, but something about this one's stillness concerned him. Wild horses didn't stand motionless next to trees. At 100 yards out, the disturbing reality became clear. The horse was chained to the tree, its head hanging low, body trembling visibly even from this distance. Jack's jaw clenched tight. In all his years, few things angered him like the mistreatment of animals, creatures that couldn't speak for themselves. "Easy now," he called out softly as he approached, not wanting to startle the animal. The horse's head jerked up, eyes wide with fear. It was a stallion, Jack realized, a white stallion with a powerful build that spoke of wild lineage, not the careful breeding of domestic stock. Despite its obvious exhaustion, the horse reared back, pulling against the heavy chain that bound it to the tree, mouth open in a silent scream of defiance. "Whoa there, easy boy," Jack said, stopping his approach about 20 feet away. The horse's nostrils flared, its breath coming in labored pants. Foam flecked its neck and chest, evidence of how long and hard it had fought against its restraint. The chain looked industrial grade, cruelly tight around the animal's neck, with links that had worn away patches of the horse's white coat, leaving raw skin beneath. Jack stood still, letting the horse grow accustomed to his presence. Years of working with rescue animals had taught him patience. After several minutes, the stallion's breathing slowed marginally, though its eyes never lost their wildness. "Who did this to you?" Jack murmured, slowly taking another step forward. The horse flinched but didn't rear again. Taking this as a positive sign, Jack eased closer, palms open, movements deliberate and slow. "I'm not here to hurt you. Just want to see what we're dealing with." 10 feet away now, Jack could see the full extent of the horse's condition. Its ribs pressed against its hide, telling a story of neglect that had begun long before it was chained to this tree. But it was when the horse turned slightly, responding to a distant sound in the forest, that Jack saw them, the scars. They ran across the stallion's flank and haunches, not random marks but deliberate patterns. Some were old, silvery against the white coat, while others looked more recent, barely healed. The methodical nature of the markings made Jack's blood run cold. These weren't the results of accidents or life in the wild. These were inflicted with purpose. Memories from his own time as a prisoner of war surged to the surface, and for a moment, the Montana morning dissolved around him, replaced by the darkness of a cell where men had left similar marks on his own body. "Jesus Christ," he whispered, his voice breaking. The horse seemed to respond to the emotion in his words, turning its head to regard Jack with an intelligence that struck him deeply. In those dark eyes, Jack recognized something he'd seen in the mirrors of VA hospitals and in the faces of his fellow veterans: trauma, resilience, and a wary hope that perhaps this time things might be different. "Okay, boy," Jack said, steadying himself. "Let's get you out of this." He reached into his pocket for the multi-tool he always carried, opening the pliers component. The horse tensed as Jack approached, but something had shifted between them. The animal seemed to understand, on some primal level, that Jack represented the possibility of freedom. The chain's lock was heavy-duty, but nothing Jack couldn't handle with the right leverage. "This might take a minute," he told the horse, working the tool against the mechanism. "Whoever put this here didn't want you getting away." As Jack worked, he kept talking in a low, soothing voice, sharing thoughts he rarely vocalized. "I know what it's like, being trapped, feeling like there's no way out." The horse's ears flicked toward him, tracking his words. 4 months in a hole in the ground taught me that. But I got out. You will too." The lock finally gave way with a satisfying click, and Jack carefully began unwinding the chain from around the tree. The horse remained still, as if understanding that movement now would only complicate its release. When the last loop came free, Jack stepped back, letting the heavy chain drop to the ground. "There you go," he said, expecting the stallion to bolt immediately. To his surprise, the horse stayed put, eyes fixed on Jack. It took a tentative step away from the tree, then another, testing its newfound freedom with caution, born of disbelief. Jack recognized that hesitation too. Freedom after captivity was disorienting, overwhelming. The horse was experiencing the same bewildered moment that Jack had felt when his rescue finally came, that suspended breath where possibility seems too fragile to trust. "It's real," Jack assured him. "You can go." He gestured toward the open grassland, the distant mountains, but the horse only moved a few paces before stopping again, turning to look back at Jack with those knowing eyes. In that moment, standing in the golden morning light with the freed stallion regarding him with cautious attention, Jack felt something shift inside his chest. A loosening of a constriction he'd carried for so long, he'd forgotten it wasn't a natural part of him. The wind whispered through the tall grass as Jack and the stallion regarded each other in silent understanding. Jack knew better than to rush things with a traumatized animal. Trust couldn't be forced. It had to be earned, especially with a creature that had clearly known the worst of human cruelty. "I should head back," Jack finally said, though he made no move to leave. "Got water at my place. Food too." He wasn't sure if he was talking to the horse or himself. The stallion took another tentative step toward him, then stopped, nostrils flaring as it caught his scent. Jack slowly reached into his pack and pulled out an apple he'd brought for his mid-hike snack. With deliberate movements, he placed it on the ground between them, then stepped back. "There you go. Probably tastier than whatever you've been getting." The horse eyed the offering suspiciously, then looked back at Jack, as if weighing the risk. Hunger eventually won out. The stallion approached the apple with halting steps, snatched it quickly, and retreated to a safe distance before devouring it in seconds. Jack nodded, satisfied with even this small victory. "I'm going to head home now," Jack said, backing away slowly. "You're free to do whatever horses do." He turned and began walking toward his cabin, deliberately not looking back. Every instinct told him that turning his back on a wild animal was foolish, but he needed to show the horse he wasn't a threat. After about 50 yards, curiosity got the better of him. Jack glanced over his shoulder, expecting to see the stallion disappearing across the grassland. Instead, the horse was following him, maintaining the exact distance between them. When Jack stopped, the horse stopped too. "Well, I'll be damned," Jack muttered. He continued walking and the stallion continued following, like some bizarre parade of two across the Montana wilderness. By the time Jack's cabin came into view, he'd accepted that he had a shadow. The horse maintained its distance, but showed no signs of leaving. As they approached the property, Jack noticed the stallion growing increasingly nervous, eyes darting toward the structures with obvious distrust. "Just a cabin and a barn," Jack explained, knowing the horse couldn't understand his words but hoping his calm tone would help. "Nothing scary here." He walked to the water pump in his yard and began filling a large trough he used for the occasional deer or elk that wandered through. The sound of water seemed to intrigue the stallion, whose thirst evidently overrode caution. Jack stepped back, giving the horse space. After several minutes of internal debate, the stallion approached the trough and began drinking desperately, confirming Jack's suspicion that it had been without water for some time. As the horse drank, Jack studied the scars more carefully. The patterns weren't random. They followed specific lines, almost like a brand, but much more elaborate. In some places, the scars formed what looked like numbers or symbols. Jack had seen enough in his military days to recognize the hallmarks of systematic abuse. "Someone wanted to mark you as theirs," he said softly. "Make sure everyone knew who you belonged to." The horse's ears flicked toward him, but it continued drinking. "I've seen men do worse to each other, but not by much." With the stallion distracted, Jack went inside his cabin and made a call to the only veterinarian in the county he trusted, Dr. Sarah Chen, who specialized in large animals and, more importantly, asked few questions. "I've got a situation," he told her when she answered. "Wild stallion, badly mistreated, won't leave my property." "Another one of your strays, Jack?" Sarah's voice carried a hint of amusement mixed with concern. "What's his condition?" "Malnourished, dehydrated, and Sarah." He hesitated. "Someone carved him up. Deliberate markings all over his flanks. Never seen anything like it." The line went silent for a moment. "I'll be there in an hour," she finally said, all traces of amusement gone. "Don't approach him any more than necessary. Even a weakened stallion can kill you if he panics." After hanging up, Jack gathered some supplies, a lead rope, some oats, and a first aid kit. He didn't plan on trying to catch the horse. That would come later, if at all, but he wanted to be prepared. Through the window, he could see the stallion had finished drinking and was now standing at the edge of his property, as if debating whether to leave or stay. Back outside, Jack set a bucket of oats near the barn, then retreated to his porch to wait. The summer sun climbed higher, casting harsh light across the land. The stallion remained at the property's edge, occasionally grazing on the sparse grass, but always keeping Jack in sight. After about 40 minutes, the sound of Sarah's truck coming up the dirt road sent the horse into a panic. It bolted to the far end of the field, mane flying as it ran with surprising speed for its condition. Jack watched with a mixture of concern and admiration. Despite everything it had been through, the horse still had fight in it. Sarah parked and climbed out, her petite frame belying the strength she needed for her job. At 45, with dark hair streaked with premature gray, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd seen it all and feared very little. "Where's your patient?" she asked, grabbing her medical bag. Jack nodded toward the distant white figure, now watching them warily from the field's edge. He's not exactly cooperative. Sarah studied the horse through binoculars from her truck. Beautiful animal. Mustang, I think, from what I can see. The white ones are rare. She lowered the binoculars, her expression grim. He's in rough shape, Jack. Needs medical attention soon. Can you dart him? Jack asked, though he already knew the answer. Not unless it's life or death. Tranquilizing a horse that malnourished is risky. We need to gain his trust. She turned to Jack, eyes serious. Any idea who did this? Jack shook his head. Found him chained to a tree about 2 miles east. Heavy chain, serious lock. Someone didn't want him getting away. There have been rumors, Sarah said carefully. Illegal horse fighting rings moving into the county. Authorities haven't found anything concrete, but... She trailed off, watching the stallion. The markings could be some kind of identification system. The thought made Jack's stomach turn. He'd seen dogfighting rings during his deployments, the brutal spectacles drawing crowds hungry for blood and violence. The idea of horses being subjected to the same fate was sickening. "What now?" he asked. Sarah set her bag down on the porch steps. "Now we wait. I brought some medicated feed that might help with pain and inflammation. We'll start there, see if he'll take it." She glanced at Jack. "This isn't going to be quick, you know. Are you up for it?" Jack watched the stallion, standing proud despite its wounds, despite everything humans had done to break it. In its defiance, he saw a reflection of his own struggle to return to civilian life after the war. The nightmares, the hypervigilance, the isolation, the scars visible and invisible. "I've got time," he said simply. "Not like my social calendar's full." Sarah smiled, recognizing the understatement for what it was, a commitment. "Then let's see if we can save him." She looked toward the white horse in the distance. First step is a name. Can't keep calling him the horse. Jack considered this for a moment, watching as the stallion pawed at the ground, still alert, still fighting. Ghost, he decided. His name is Ghost. The next morning arrived with a golden haze, the sun painting the mountains in shades of amber and rose. Jack stepped onto his porch, coffee in hand, eyes immediately seeking the white form of Ghost. To his relief, the stallion was still there, grazing at the far edge of the property. He'd half expected the horse to disappear during the night, fleeing back to the wilderness where humans couldn't hurt him. "Stubborn," Jack murmured approvingly. He understood stubbornness. It had kept him alive in Afghanistan, and later, during the dark years after his return when the demons in his head nearly won. Sarah had left the previous evening after they'd made modest progress. Ghost had eventually eaten some of the medicated feed, though he'd approached the offering with extreme caution, backing away several times before hunger overrode fear. Even then, he'd kept his eyes fixed on the humans, ready to bolt at the slightest threatening movement. Now Jack settled into the wooden chair on his porch, prepared for another day of patience. The vet had warned him that gaining Ghost's trust could take weeks, even months. "You can't rush healing," she'd said, and Jack knew she wasn't just talking about the horse's physical wounds. Around mid-morning, a familiar truck came bumping up the dirt road that led to Jack's isolated property. Sam Foster, the county sheriff and one of the few people Jack considered a friend, pulled up beside the cabin. Ghost immediately retreated further from the house, watching the newcomer with tense alertness. "Morning, Jack," Sam called, stepping out of his vehicle. At 53, Sam carried himself with the ease of a man comfortable in his authority, but not obsessed with it. His weathered face crinkled with concern as he nodded toward Ghost. "Heard from Sarah you found yourself a project." Jack grunted in acknowledgement. "News travels fast." "Small county," Sam shrugged, joining Jack on the porch. "Mind if I take a look at him?" Jack handed Sam the binoculars. "Don't approach him. He's skittish around new people." Sam studied Ghost through the lenses, his expression darkening. "Jesus," he muttered. "Those markings aren't natural." "Someone carved him up," Jack said flatly. "You know anything about horse fighting in the area?" Sam lowered the binoculars, his jaw tight. "Been hearing rumors for about 6 months now. Nothing concrete enough for a warrant. A couple of ranch hands down in Clearwater mentioned fights happening out in the old mining district, but by the time we checked it out, there was nothing there. Ghost didn't chain himself to that tree," Jack pointed out, "and those marks aren't random. Someone's operating in the area." Sam sighed, running a hand over his thinning hair. "We don't have the manpower for constant patrols in the backcountry. Budget cuts hit us hard last year." He fixed Jack with a serious look. "Where exactly did you find him?" Jack described the location in detail, and Sam jotted notes in a small pad. "I'll check it out, see if they left anything behind. Might help us build a case." He paused. "You should know, though, if this horse was used for fighting, someone might come looking for him. These operations involve serious money." "Let them come," Jack said, his voice carrying a quiet danger that reminded Sam that beneath Jack's solitary, peaceful existence lay the training and experience of a decorated combat veteran. Sam studied his friend. "Be careful, Jack. These aren't just some local thugs. The rumors say this operation has connections to organized groups out of Chicago and Vegas." Jack merely nodded, his eyes on Ghost, who had begun cautiously moving closer to the house now that the initial shock of the visitor's arrival had passed. "He's coming around," Sam observed. "That's a good sign." "Slowly," Jack agreed. "But he's still got one foot ready to run at all times. Can't blame him." Before leaving, Sam promised to increase patrols in the area and to call Jack if he found anything at the tree site. "In the meantime, keep your rifle handy," he advised, "and call if anything seems off." After Sam departed, Jack returned to his patient vigil. By late afternoon, he'd moved a chair closer to where Ghost was grazing, still maintaining a respectful distance, but gradually decreasing the space between them. The stallion watched him warily but continued eating, a tentative acceptance of Jack's presence. As the sun began its descent, painting the sky in deepening shades of orange and purple, Jack spoke softly to Ghost, not expecting understanding, but offering the comfort of a gentle voice. "You know, I didn't think I'd make it back either," he confessed, watching as the horse's ears swiveled toward him. 4 months in that hole. Darkness, pain, wondering if each day would be my last. He took a deep breath, surprised at how easily the words came when addressed to the silent animal. "When they finally got me out, I didn't know how to live anymore, couldn't sleep, couldn't connect with people. Everything felt wrong." Ghost had stopped grazing, his dark eyes fixed on Jack with an intensity that felt almost like comprehension. "Took me years to realize I was still living in that hole, even after I came home. My body was free, but up here..." Jack tapped his temple. "Up here, I was still a prisoner." The confession hung in the air between them, man and horse connected by the shared experience of captivity and pain. Ghost took a hesitant step closer, then another, until he stood just 15 feet from Jack's chair. It was the closest he'd come voluntarily. "That's it," Jack encouraged softly. "No rush." Ghost lowered his head slightly, nostrils flaring as he caught Jack's scent. For several long moments they simply existed together in the fading light, neither advancing nor retreating. Then, with deliberate slowness, Jack reached into his pocket and pulled out an apple, placing it on the ground before returning to his motionless position. The stallion regarded the offering, clearly torn between hunger and caution. Finally, with a snort that sounded almost like resignation, Ghost approached, snatched the apple and retreated, but not as far as before. He ate while watching Jack, and when he finished, he didn't move away. Instead, he lowered his head and began grazing again, maintaining the decreased distance between them. Jack allowed himself a small smile. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was a beginning. As darkness fell, Jack reluctantly headed back to his cabin, leaving Ghost to decide whether to stay or go during the night. Inside, he prepared for bed with his usual efficiency, the routine of a man accustomed to solitude. But before turning in, he found himself standing at the window, gazing out at the moonlit field where Ghost's white form glowed like a ghost in the darkness. The horse had moved closer to the house, not right up against it, but considerably nearer than where he'd spent the previous night. Something about that simple fact filled Jack with unexpected warmth. Two broken souls, finding cautious comfort in proximity, not quite together, but no longer entirely alone. Dawn broke with a thunderstorm, rain lashing against the cabin's windows as Jack prepared his morning coffee. His first thought was of Ghost, how the stallion would handle the downpour, whether he'd seek shelter or flee. Jack had spent enough time with wild animals to know that weather could trigger unpredictable behaviors, especially in creatures already on edge. When the rain temporarily eased to a drizzle, Jack stepped onto the porch, scanning the property for any sign of white among the gray landscape. For a moment, he saw nothing, and an unexpected pang of disappointment struck him. Of course the horse had left. It was the logical thing, the wild thing to do. Then movement caught his eye. Ghost stood beneath the overhang of the old barn, his white coat gleaming even in the dim light. The stallion had found shelter on his own, choosing to remain on the property rather than return to the wilderness. Something about that choice felt significant to Jack, though he was careful not to read too much into it. After breakfast, Jack donned his rain gear and made his way to the barn, carrying a bucket of feed mixed with the medication Sarah had provided. Ghost watched his approach, ears forward, body tense, but not panicked. "Morning," Jack called softly, stopping at what he'd come to recognize as Ghost's comfort boundary, about 12 feet away. "Brought you breakfast." He set the bucket down and backed away, giving the horse space. Ghost eyed the food, then Jack, then the food again. His hunger evident, the stallion approached the bucket with less hesitation than previous days, though still maintaining awareness of Jack's position. While Ghost ate, Jack carefully studied his condition. The scars stood out starkly against his wet coat. But what concerned Jack more was a new development, a slight tremor in the horse's right front leg. It wasn't constant, but it appeared whenever Ghost put weight on that limb. An injury Jack hadn't noticed before, perhaps, or one that was worsening. Jack made a mental note to mention it to Sarah when she arrived for her scheduled visit that afternoon. He spent the rest of the morning working around the property, always keeping Ghost in his peripheral vision. The horse didn't leave the barn area, seemingly content with the shelter it provided from the intermittent rain. Sarah's truck arrived shortly after lunch, splashing through puddles on the dirt road. Unlike before, Ghost didn't bolt at her arrival, though his posture stiffened noticeably. "He's still here," Sarah observed as she stepped out, medical bag in hand. "That's promising." Jack nodded, leading her toward the barn. "Notice he's favoring his right front leg. Started this morning, or at least that's when I first saw it." Sarah watched Ghost's movement with practiced eyes. Might have been masked by his general condition before. Could be an old injury acting up because of the weather. She set her bag down slowly, careful not to make sudden movements. "How close can you get to him now?" "About 10 feet before he gets antsy," Jack replied. "Better than 50, Sarah acknowledged. Still not close enough for a proper exam, though. They spent the next hour attempting to approach Ghost, using the techniques Sarah had suggested. Slow movements, quiet voices, and plenty of treats. The stallion allowed them to reduce the distance to about 8 feet, progress that Sarah deemed significant. "His body condition is improving," she noted. "He's putting on weight, which is good, but I'm concerned about that leg. and I still can't properly treat those wounds without getting closer." She frowned in thought. "We might need to consider sedation if we can't make more progress soon. Some of those deeper cuts could be infected." Jack watched Ghost, who was now grazing near the barn entrance, keeping them in his sight. "Give him time, he's coming around." Sarah smiled at that. "You sound pretty confident for someone who claimed to know nothing about horses a few days ago." Jack shrugged. "I know about trust and trauma." He didn't elaborate, and Sarah didn't press him. Before leaving, she provided more medication and instructions for monitoring Ghost's condition. "Call me immediately if that leg gets worse or if he shows signs of fever," she insisted. "And Jack, be careful. Every time I drive up here, I half expect to find you trampled. He's still a wild animal, not a pet." "Understood," Jack assured her, though in truth he'd stopped thinking of Ghost as just a wild animal days ago. After Sarah's departure, Jack returned to his workshop behind the cabin. He'd been carving wood for years, finding in the repetitive, precise motions a meditative quality that helped quiet his mind. Today, he worked on a small figure, letting his thoughts wander as his hands moved almost independently. He was so absorbed in his task that he didn't immediately notice the sound of hooves approaching. When he finally looked up, Ghost stood at the workshop's open doorway, watching him with those intelligent dark eyes. Jack froze, hardly daring to breathe. This was the closest the horse had voluntarily come, and the first time he'd approached Jack rather than the other way around. "Hey there," Jack said softly, remaining perfectly still. Ghost's ears flicked forward, focusing on Jack's voice. The stallion took one tentative step into the workshop, then another, nostrils flaring as he investigated the new space. The scent of fresh wood shavings and linseed oil filled the air, unfamiliar but apparently not threatening. For several minutes they existed in perfect stillness, man and horse separated by just a few feet of workshop floor. Then Ghost did something that caught Jack completely off guard. He lowered his head and extended his muzzle toward Jack's hand, not quite touching, but close enough that Jack could feel the warmth of his breath. Jack remained motionless, scarcely breathing, understanding instinctively that this was a monumental moment of trust. After what seemed an eternity, Ghost's muzzle brushed against his fingers in the lightest of touches before the stallion abruptly backed away, as if startled by his own boldness. But he didn't flee. Instead, Ghost retreated just to the doorway, where he stood watching Jack with what almost seemed like curiosity. "Progress," Jack murmured, a smile tugging at his lips. That evening, Jack received a call from Sam. The sheriff had investigated the tree where Ghost had been chained and found evidence that troubled him. Tire tracks from multiple vehicles, cigarette butts, and most disturbingly, traces of blood in the soil around the tree. "Lab results came back," Sam said, his voice grim. "Not just horse blood. We found traces of at least 3 different equine DNA signatures, plus some bovine." Jack's grip on the phone tightened. "They're using that spot regularly." "Looks like it. Could be a transfer point where they evaluate new animals before moving them to wherever they're holding the fights." Sam paused. "There's more. One of my deputies recognized the description of those markings on your horse. Said his cousin down in Arizona mentioned something similar, numbers and symbols carved into fighting horses as part of some sick betting system." Jack glanced out the window at Ghost, who was grazing peacefully in the twilight. "How do we stop them?" "We're setting up surveillance," Sam replied. "But these operations are mobile. By the time we get enough evidence for a warrant, they've usually moved on." He hesitated. "Jack, if these people realize you have one of their horses..." "I know," Jack said quietly. "I'll be ready." The next few days passed in a rhythm that began to feel almost natural to Jack. Each morning, he'd wake before dawn, make his coffee, and step onto the porch to find Ghost waiting nearby. As if their silent greeting had become a ritual, important to them both. During the day, Jack would work around the property while Ghost grazed or rested in the shade of the barn. The distance between them steadily decreased, Ghost now comfortable with Jack approaching within 5 feet before showing signs of nervousness. It was a dance of patience and respect, 1 step forward and occasionally half a step back. Jack found himself talking to Ghost more and more, sharing thoughts he hadn't voiced in years. There was something freeing about speaking to a creature that couldn't judge, couldn't offer unwanted advice, couldn't respond with the uncomfortable pity Jack had grown to despise in his interactions with other humans. "You're good company," Jack told Ghost one afternoon as they shared the shade of a large pine near the cabin. "Don't interrupt, don't ask stupid questions." Ghost's ear flicked toward him, acknowledging his voice. "My ex-wife would say I finally found someone who lets me be as antisocial as I want." The mention of Andrea surprised even Jack. They'd been divorced for over a decade, their relationship another casualty of what the war had done to him. She'd tried, God knows she'd tried, but in the end, the man who returned wasn't the one she'd married. Jack couldn't blame her for leaving. Some days, he'd wanted to leave himself, escape the prison of his own mind. Ghost shifted slightly, moving a half step closer to Jack, close enough that Jack could see the intricate patterns of the scars on his flank. In the improving condition of the horse, with muscle beginning to build over once protruding ribs, the deliberate nature of the markings became even clearer. "Someone took their time with you," Jack muttered, anger rising in his throat. Ghost sensed the change in his tone and tensed immediately, head raising, eyes suddenly alert. Jack forced himself to exhale slowly, regulating his voice back to calmness. "Sorry, boy, not angry at you." The stallion relaxed marginally but maintained his vigilance. Jack made a mental note to better control his emotions around Ghost. The horse had clearly learned to associate human anger with pain. Later that afternoon, Sarah arrived for her regular checkup. This time, Ghost allowed her to approach within arm's reach, a breakthrough that had the vet beaming with professional satisfaction. "I honestly didn't think we'd get this far this quickly," she admitted as she carefully examined Ghost's leg. The stallion stood remarkably still, though his muscles remained tense beneath her touch. "The tremor is less pronounced. Could be a strain that's healing, though there's old damage here too." Sarah moved on to examining the wounds, now able to apply a topical antibiotic directly to the deeper cuts. "These are healing well, all things considered," she commented. "No signs of serious infection. He's a resilient one." "Tell me about the markings," Jack said quietly, keeping his voice neutral for Ghost's sake. "What do you make of them?" Sarah's expression darkened as she traced the air just above one particularly deliberate pattern. "This isn't random cruelty, Jack. These were done with precision. The spacing, the depth, someone knew exactly what they were doing. Sam thinks there's some kind of identification system for betting." Sarah nodded grimly. "Makes sense. This section here almost looks like numbers, maybe odds or statistics." She straightened up, giving Ghost a gentle pat that the horse tolerated with only minimal flinching. "The good news is that physically, he's improving steadily. Another week or two and those wounds will be mostly healed." "And the psychological damage?" Jack asked, knowing the answer before Sarah spoke. "That's harder to predict," she admitted. "Some horses never fully recover from abuse this severe. Others can eventually adapt, learn to trust again. It depends on the individual animal and—" She glanced at Jack meaningfully. "On who's helping them heal." After Sarah left, Jack spent the evening on his porch, watching as distant lightning flickered over the mountains. Ghost grazed nearby, occasionally raising his head to track the same lightning, ears pivoting toward the far-off rumble of thunder. Jack's phone buzzed with a text from Sam. "Need to talk. We'll stop by tomorrow morning. Keep your eyes open." The cryptic message left Jack uneasy. He checked his rifle, making sure it was clean and loaded before placing it near his bed, a precaution he hadn't felt necessary since moving to the mountains. As he turned out the lights, he noticed Ghost had moved closer to the cabin than ever before, almost as if the horse sensed the same unease that Jack felt. Sleep came fitfully, punctuated by dreams that blended past and present, the suffocating darkness of captivity in Afghanistan morphing into shadowy figures approaching his cabin, their faces hidden but their intentions clear. Jack woke before dawn, his body tense, senses heightened in the way they used to be during combat operations. Something wasn't right. He dressed quickly and silently, years of training taking over as he moved through the cabin without turning on lights. Outside, the pre-dawn world was silent except for the soft rustle of wind through pines. Ghost was nowhere to be seen, which immediately raised Jack's alarm. The stallion had slept near the cabin every night for the past week. Jack retrieved his rifle and moved to the edge of the porch, scanning the property methodically, sector by sector, as he'd been taught. Nothing seemed out of place at first, then he caught it, the faintest gleam of metal near the tree line at the far edge of his land. Not the random reflection of dew on leaves, but something solid, something that shouldn't be there. The distant sound of a horse's frightened whinny confirmed Jack's suspicions. Ghost was in trouble. Moving with the silent efficiency that had once made him an effective operator in hostile territory, Jack skirted the edge of his property, using the trees and underbrush as cover. As he drew closer to the source of the reflection, voices became audible, men speaking in low, urgent tones. "Just get the damn rope around him," one voice hissed. "Boss wants him back today." "Easy for you to say," another replied. "That animal's crazy. Nearly took my hand off." Jack crept closer, using the pre-dawn shadows to his advantage. Through a gap in the trees, he could now see them. 3 men attempting to corner Ghost against the property fence. One held what looked like a cattle prod, while another had a heavy rope fashioned into a crude lasso. Ghost was backing away, ears pinned flat against his head, eyes wild with panic and fury. Jack's finger moved to the rifle's trigger, but he hesitated. While he had every right to defend his property and Ghost from trespassers, shooting would escalate the situation irreversibly. And Ghost, already terrified, might bolt directly into the path of any gunfire. "That's the horse that killed Martinez," the third man said, his voice carrying a note of wary respect. "Stomped his chest in during the last match. Worth a fortune now." Jack felt cold rage building inside him. These men weren't just thieves. They were the ones responsible for Ghost's scars, for the fear that still haunted the stallion's eyes. They were the monsters who had turned a wild, free creature into a weapon for their entertainment. Jack's military training took over, pushing emotion aside in favor of tactical assessment. 3 men, one possibly armed with more than just the cattle prod. Ghost cornered, but still dangerous. Dawn approaching, which would soon eliminate his advantage of familiarity with the terrain. He needed to act now. Jack moved silently through the underbrush, positioning himself between the intruders and their likely escape route. Then, with deliberate force, he chambered a round in his rifle, the distinctive sound cutting through the pre-dawn stillness like a gunshot itself. "You're trespassing," Jack called, his voice deadly calm. "Drop the prod and the rope." The men froze, heads whipping toward the sound. Ghost used the distraction to break away from the fence, putting more distance between himself and his tormentors. "This doesn't concern you," the largest of the 3 men responded, turning to face Jack's voice, though he couldn't yet see him clearly in the dim light. "That horse is stolen property." "Can't steal what was never owned," Jack replied, stepping partially into view while keeping the rifle trained on them. "He's a wild horse you chained and tortured." The 3 exchanged glances, clearly reassessing the situation. The man with the cattle prod slowly set it on the ground, raising his hand slightly. "Look, mister, there's been a misunderstanding. We're just retrieving what belongs to our employer." Your employer who runs illegal horse fights? Jack kept his voice level, gaze steady. The one who carved up animals for betting purposes. Something shifted in the largest man's expression. Surprise, quickly masked by calculation. You don't want to get involved in this. People who interfere tend to have accidents. Like Martinez? Jack asked, watching their reactions closely. The mention of the name they'd referenced earlier caused visible tension. Funny thing about living out here, you hear everything. The third man, who had remained silent until now, suddenly reached toward his waistband. Jack immediately adjusted his aim. I wouldn't, he warned. The man's hand froze. You a cop? Asked the one who'd put down the cattle prod. Worse, Jack replied. I'm a man protecting what's mine. The sound of an approaching vehicle broke the standoff. All heads turned toward the dirt road where headlights cut through the lingering darkness. Jack recognized the profile of Sam's sheriff's cruiser and allowed himself the briefest moment of relief. Seems like the law's arrived, Jack said, maintaining his position. I suggest you stay exactly where you are. The largest man spat on the ground. You have no idea who you're dealing with, old man? Jack's eyes hardened. Neither do you. Sam's cruiser pulled up at the edge of the property, and the sheriff stepped out, hand resting on his holstered weapon. Two deputies emerged from a second vehicle that had followed close behind. Everything all right, Jack? Sam called, though his tone and posture made it clear he'd already assessed the situation. Just explaining the concept of private property to these gentlemen, Jack replied, not lowering his rifle. The men, now caught between Jack's aim and the approaching law enforcement, exchanged tense glances. The large one made a subtle head movement toward the tree line, but Sam's voice cut through the dawn air. Don't even think about it, the sheriff warned. All of you, hands where I can see them. The next few minutes unfolded with the efficient procedure of rural law enforcement. The deputies handcuffed the three men while Sam collected the cattle prod as evidence. Jack finally lowered his rifle, the adrenaline that had kept him focused now beginning to ebb, leaving his hands with a slight tremor. Ghost had retreated to the far side of the pasture, watching the scene unfold with tense alertness. Jack wanted to go to him immediately, to reassure him that the danger had passed, but he knew better than to approach a traumatized horse in this state. Instead, he stayed put, answering Sam's questions while keeping Ghost in his peripheral vision. They mentioned someone named Martinez, Jack told Sam quietly as the deputies loaded the men into the cruiser. Said Ghost killed him during a fight. Sam nodded grimly. That might explain why they were so determined to get him back. A horse that's proven itself lethal would be valuable in their circles. He glanced toward Ghost. Also explains why he's so distrustful of humans. Can you hold them? For now. Trespassing, attempted theft, animal cruelty if we can connect them to his injuries. Sam rubbed his chin thoughtfully. But without solid evidence linking them to the fighting operation, they'll probably make bail by tomorrow. Jack's jaw tightened. They'll be back. Not right away, Sam assured him. And not alone next time. These types don't like witnesses. He gave Jack a pointed look. You should consider staying somewhere else for a while. This is my home, Jack said simply. I'm not leaving. Sam sighed, recognizing the futility of arguing. Then at least let me station a deputy nearby for a few days. Jack wanted to refuse, but knew better. His stubbornness wouldn't help Ghost if more of these men returned in force. Fine, but not too close. Ghost is spooked enough as it is. After Sam and the deputies departed with their prisoners, Jack turned his full attention to Ghost. The stallion remained at a distance, his posture tense, eyes wild with a fear that seemed to have erased days of careful trust-building. It's okay now, Jack called softly, making no move to approach. They're gone. Ghost pawed at the ground nervously, his breathing still rapid. The encounter had clearly triggered traumatic memories for the stallion, associations of humans with pain and fighting that Jack had been working so hard to overcome. Patience, Jack reminded himself. He sat down cross-legged in the grass, making himself smaller, less threatening. Then he simply waited, letting Ghost process the situation in his own time. The sun had fully risen by the time Ghost showed the first sign of relaxation, his head lowering slightly, ears no longer pinned flat against his skull. Jack remained motionless, speaking occasionally in a calm, even tone, not expecting Ghost to approach, but wanting him to remember that this human voice meant safety, not harm. Around mid-morning, Sarah arrived, having been called by Sam. She assessed the situation quickly, nodding approval at Jack's distance and posture. "You're doing exactly right," she said quietly, sitting beside him. "After a trauma like this, he needs time to recalibrate." "Will this set back his progress?" Jack asked, the question carrying more weight than he'd intended to reveal. Sarah considered Ghost thoughtfully. "Maybe, but maybe not. Sometimes facing a threat alongside someone they're beginning to trust can actually strengthen the bond." She glanced at Jack. "He saw you defend him. That matters." They spent the next hour in companionable silence, Jack and Sarah sitting together, while Ghost gradually settled. When the stallion finally approached the water trough about 50 yards away, both humans released breaths they hadn't realized they were holding. "I should examine him when he's calmer," Sarah said. "Make sure the stress didn't aggravate his injuries." Jack nodded, his eyes never leaving Ghost. "They said he killed someone during one of their fights." Sarah's expression darkened. "If true, they pushed him to it. Horses aren't naturally aggressive toward humans. They have to be driven to that point through extreme abuse." She shook her head sadly. "It explains a lot about his behavior. His extreme wariness isn't just from physical abuse, it's from being forced to fight for his life." The days following the confrontation settled into a tense vigilance. True to his word, Sam stationed a deputy in an unmarked vehicle at the turnoff to Jack's property, far enough away not to disturb Ghost, but close enough to respond quickly if needed. Jack found himself checking the tree line more frequently, his old combat instincts resurfacing with uncomfortable familiarity. Ghost remained distant, the progress of previous weeks seemingly erased by the encounter with his former abusers. He stayed at the far edge of the property, approaching the water trough and feed bucket only when Jack wasn't visible. Each retreat felt like a personal failure to Jack, though Sarah assured him during her visits that this setback was expected, not permanent. "He's processing," she explained one afternoon as they watched Ghost from the porch. "Remember, his experience with humans has been overwhelmingly negative. One good connection with you doesn't erase years of trauma, especially when those who hurt him suddenly reappeared." Jack nodded, though the rational explanation did little to ease his frustration. "I just hate seeing him like this again. Afraid all the time." Sarah studied Jack with the same thoughtful gaze she usually directed at her animal patients. "You know, in my experience, people who connect deeply with traumatized animals often see themselves reflected in that trauma." Jack didn't respond, uncomfortable with how accurately Sarah had pinpointed what he'd been feeling. Ghost's regression mirrored his own experience after returning from war, the way a single sound or smell could catapult him back to Afghanistan, erasing years of careful recovery in an instant. "I have some contacts at the BLM," Sarah said, changing the subject. "Once Ghost is fully recovered physically, we should discuss his future. Wild horses are federally protected, but his situation is complicated given the circumstances." "What do you mean, his future?" Jack asked, an unexpected defensiveness rising in his voice. Sarah chose her words carefully. "Well, normally, a rehabilitated wild horse would either be released back to a herd or placed in an adoption program. But Ghost's history makes both options problematic. He's been traumatized by humans, which complicates adoption, and he's been forced to become aggressive, which could make reintegration with other horses difficult. The thought of Ghost being taken away, handed over to government bureaucracy, or forced back into a wild existence where he might never fully recover, left Jack with a hollow feeling. He hadn't planned on keeping a horse permanently when he first found Ghost. Now he couldn't imagine his property without the white stallion grazing in the distance. "He stays here," Jack said simply. "As long as he wants to." Sarah smiled but said nothing. They both knew the decision might not be entirely up to them, especially if the investigation into the horse fighting ring progressed. That evening, after Sarah left, Jack sat on his porch with a cup of coffee, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. Ghost stood at the edge of the pasture, his white coat glowing in the fading light, head raised as he too seemed to contemplate the vista. On impulse, Jack set down his coffee and walked to the middle of the yard, then simply sat cross-legged in the grass. He made no attempt to call Ghost or entice him with food. Instead, he just sat, breathing deeply, making himself as non-threatening as possible. "I know what it's like," he said quietly, not expecting Ghost to hear from such a distance. "When the past comes back. When you think you're healing, and then suddenly you're right back in that hole, feeling every bit of pain like it just happened." Jack closed his eyes, focusing on the sensation of the evening breeze against his skin, the scent of pine and earth, the solid ground beneath him. Grounding techniques his therapist had taught him years ago. "The difference is, I had to climb out alone. You don't." He sat there as darkness fell, not moving, not demanding anything. Eventually, he opened his eyes and found that Ghost had moved closer, not approaching directly, but grazing in a slow arc that had brought him nearer than he'd been since the confrontation. Progress, however small, was still progress. Over the next few days, Jack repeated this ritual, sitting in the same spot at sunset, sometimes speaking softly, sometimes simply existing in shared silence. Each evening, Ghost's grazing pattern brought him slightly closer. On the fourth day, Sam visited with news. The men they'd arrested had indeed been released on bail, but the investigation was gathering momentum. "We executed a search warrant on a property about 30 miles south," Sam explained, keeping his voice low as they stood on the porch, Ghost visible in the distance. "Found evidence of recent horse fighting activities, makeshift arena, betting slips, even some equipment used to modify the animals." His expression darkened at this last part. "Any arrests?" "Not yet. The place was abandoned recently, but we've identified the property owner, Ramon Vega. He's known to law enforcement in 3 states, mostly for gambling and racketeering charges that never stuck." Jack absorbed this information, connecting it to what he'd learned about Ghost. "He's the one who had Ghost marked." "Most likely," Sam agreed. "From what we've pieced together, these operations move between remote locations on a rotating schedule. Makes them hard to track. But now we know who to watch." "And the men who came here?" "Still in the area, based on hotel records. They're being monitored." Sam looked troubled. "But Jack, you should know. We found records at the site. Betting histories, animal stats, that kind of thing. There was a white stallion listed as the Ghost, who was undefeated in 10 matches. Jack's gaze shifted to Ghost, peacefully grazing in the fading light. It was hard to reconcile the gentle animal he'd come to know with the image of a fighting machine who had killed a man. The final entry noted that the Ghost had been scheduled for special handling after killing his handler, Sam continued. "I think they were planning to put him down, Jack, not out of mercy, but because he'd become too dangerous to control." The revelation landed heavily between them. Ghost hadn't just been abandoned, he'd been left chained to that tree to die, punishment for an act of rebellion born from years of abuse. He was fighting back the only way he knew how, Jack said quietly. Sam nodded. Just thought you should know what we're dealing with. These people aren't just criminals, they're vindictive. In their eyes, that horse robbed them of both money and respect. After Sam left, Jack returned to his spot in the yard, sitting in silence as twilight settled over the mountains. His mind kept returning to the image of Ghost in a fighting arena, driven to violence through systematic torture, then discarded like garbage when he finally turned on his tormentors. When Ghost's slow, circling path finally brought him within 20 feet, the closest he'd been since the confrontation, Jack spoke softly, not looking directly at the horse, but making sure his voice carried clearly. I understand now, he said, why you're so afraid, why you don't trust. But you're not that animal anymore, and they can't make you be him again. A week passed with gradual improvements in Ghost's trust. Each day, Jack sat in his spot in the yard, and each day, Ghost ventured a little closer. By the seventh evening, the stallion stood just 10 feet away, grazing with cautious attention divided between the grass and Jack. It wasn't the comfort they'd begun to establish before, but it was progress Jack could measure. The deputy's presence at the turnoff continued, though Jack knew the surveillance couldn't last indefinitely. Resources were stretched thin in the rural county, and despite Sam's dedication to the case, other priorities would eventually take precedence. On a cool morning, Jack sat on his porch cleaning his rifle when the familiar sound of Sarah's truck coming up the drive caught his attention. Ghost, who had been grazing nearby, raised his head but didn't bolt, another small victory. Sarah stepped out of her vehicle carrying not just her usual medical bag but also a larger equipment case. Morning, Jack, she called. Thought we might try something today if you're up for it. Jack set aside the rifle. What did you have in mind? Ghost is healing well physically, she explained, but we still can't get close enough for a proper examination of those deeper wounds. I'd like to try using a mild sedative, nothing that would knock him out completely, just something to calm him enough for proper treatment. Jack frowned, immediately protective. I don't know, Sarah. He's been through enough. I understand your concern, she said, setting her bags down carefully. But some of those deeper cuts could develop complications if left untreated much longer. And there's his leg. I need to do a proper evaluation. Jack considered this, watching Ghost as the stallion observed their interaction from a distance. The horse's right front leg still occasionally trembled, especially when he'd been standing still for long periods. How would we do it? Jack finally asked. Dart gun, Sarah replied. Designed specifically for large animals. The dosage is calibrated for his estimated weight, just enough to make him drowsy and less reactive to handling. Jack's jaw tightened at the mention of a gun, however non-lethal. He's been through enough trauma. I know, Sarah said gently, but sometimes a brief discomfort is necessary for healing. She studied Jack's expression. This isn't just about Ghost, is it? Jack didn't answer immediately. The truth was, he'd been sedated against his will during his captivity, kept compliant for interrogations that invariably ended in torture. The thought of subjecting Ghost to anything remotely similar, regardless of the good intentions, made his stomach turn. He should have a choice, Jack finally said. Sarah considered this, then nodded slowly. How about a compromise? We'll try one more time to approach him naturally. If that doesn't work, then we consider the sedation. They spent the next hour using every technique Sarah knew to gain Ghost's trust. Jack sat in the grass with feed in his outstretched hand while Sarah remained a short distance away, speaking softly and moving with deliberate slowness. Ghost approached cautiously, drawing near enough to take the feed from Jack's hand, another milestone, but still dancing away whenever Sarah tried to close the gap. He trusts you, Sarah observed, but not me, not enough. Jack sighed, recognizing the truth in her assessment. What if I'm the one to examine him? Could you guide me through what to look for? Sarah appeared surprised but intrigued by the suggestion. It's unorthodox, but yes, I think that could work. Your hands aren't trained, but your eyes can be. She spent the next half hour instructing Jack on basic wound assessment, what healthy healing looked like versus signs of infection, how to check for heat or swelling around injuries, the proper way to evaluate muscle tone around the damaged leg. As evening approached, Jack sat in his usual spot with a small kit of supplies Sarah had prepared. Ghost, recognizing the routine, approached with greater confidence than he'd shown in days. This time, Jack softly patted the ground beside him. "Come on, Ghost," he murmured. "Let me help you." To both his and Sarah's amazement watching from the porch, Ghost cautiously lowered himself to the ground near Jack, not quite within reach but closer than ever before. The horse's sides expanded and contracted with deep breaths, as if gathering courage. Jack remained perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe. Ghost's behavior was unprecedented. Lying down near a human represented a vulnerability the traumatized stallion had never before displayed. "That's it," Jack whispered. "You're safe here." Minutes passed in perfect stillness. Then, with movements so gradual they were barely perceptible, Ghost shifted his position, inching closer to Jack until finally his body rested just within arm's reach. Jack glanced toward Sarah, who nodded encouragement from her distant position on the porch. With infinite care, Jack extended his hand, letting Ghost see and smell it before gently touching the stallion's neck. Ghost tensed but didn't pull away. "I'm just going to check your wounds," Jack explained softly, running his hand along Ghost's side until he reached the area where the deepest scars marked the white hide. Following Sarah's instructions, Jack carefully examined each healing wound, noting that most had closed cleanly with new pink skin forming beneath. One larger cut on Ghost's flank still looked tender, with slight discharge that concerned him. "This one's not quite right," he called softly to Sarah, who made notes but maintained her distance. When Jack reached Ghost's front leg, he felt the horse tense beneath his touch. "Easy," he murmured. "I know it hurts. Let me see." The leg had an old, poorly healed break. Jack could feel the unnatural bump along the bone beneath the skin. The area was warm but not hot, suggesting chronic inflammation rather than acute infection. "They worked you with a broken leg," Jack realized aloud, anger and compassion mingling in his voice. "Bastards didn't even let it heal." Ghost's dark eye regarded him steadily, neither panicked nor fully relaxed. It was a gaze of assessment, weighing Jack's intentions with the caution of an animal who had learned the hard way that humans' gentle touches could precede the greatest pain. When Jack finished his examination and slowly backed away, Ghost remained on the ground for several minutes before carefully rising to his feet. Instead of retreating, the stallion stood his ground, allowing Jack to remain closer than ever before. That night, after reporting his findings to Sarah, Jack sat on his porch watching Ghost graze in the moonlight. Sarah had prescribed antibiotics for the concerning wound and recommended continued rest for the leg, which would likely never fully heal but could improve with time. "He's a survivor," Sarah had said before leaving. "Like someone else I know." Jack hadn't responded, but her words lingered. The parallels between his journey and Ghost's were impossible to ignore. Both broken by human cruelty, both struggling to trust again, both carrying wounds that would never completely disappear. His phone buzzed with a text from Sam. "Meeting tomorrow. Important developments. 9 a.m., my office." Jack sent a brief acknowledgement, his mind already racing with possibilities. Was it news about Vega? Had they located the next fighting venue? Whatever it was, Jack knew that Ghost's future, and perhaps his own, hung in the balance. Jack woke before dawn, his mind already cycling through possibilities of what Sam needed to discuss. He found Ghost sleeping near the cabin, closer than ever before, Another small victory that would have filled him with satisfaction under different circumstances. Today, however, his thoughts were preoccupied with Sam's message and what it might mean for Ghost's future. After ensuring Ghost had fresh water and feed, Jack drove to town, the first time he'd left the property for more than a few minutes since finding the stallion. The county sheriff's office occupied a modest brick building on the main street, its parking lot containing only a handful of vehicles this early in the morning. Sam greeted him at the door, his expression revealing little. "Thanks for coming in, Jack." Inside Sam's office, Jack found they weren't alone. A woman in a crisp suit sat beside Sam's desk, her posture suggesting federal law enforcement before she even produced her credentials. "Special Agent Diana Reeves, FBI." She introduced herself, extending a hand that Jack shook automatically. "I understand you've become central to an ongoing investigation." Jack glanced at Sam, who nodded reassuringly. "Agent Reeves is heading a multi-state task force on illegal animal fighting operations. Your situation with Ghost has provided a breakthrough." For the next hour, Jack listened as Reeves outlined what they knew about Ramon Vega's operation. The horse fighting ring wasn't just a local problem. It was part of a sophisticated network spanning 5 states, with millions in illegal gambling flowing through it. Ghost, it turned out, had been Vega's prized fighter, a centerpiece attraction who had never lost a match. "The horse you call Ghost was known in these circles as El Fantasma," Reeves explained, sliding a photograph across the desk. The image showed a fighting ring with dirt floor and plywood walls. In the center stood a white horse, barely recognizable as Ghost, thinner, wild-eyed, rearing at a handler who wielded what looked like a prod. His stats were legendary. 10 wins, most by serious injury to the opponent. The last match ended with his handler's death. Jack studied the photo, his stomach turning at the visible evidence of Ghost's suffering. They were going to kill him for that. They chained him to die. "Probably," Reeves agreed. "But Vega's not known for wasting assets. Our theory is they were transporting him to another facility for breeding purposes, creating the next generation of fighters. The chain was temporary." "Then how did he end up abandoned?" Jack asked. Sam interjected. "We think they were spooked. One of our highway patrol officers reported a suspicious vehicle that night, initiated a stop, but they fled. Might have decided Ghost was too much trouble to transport if they were already being watched." Reeves nodded. "Whatever the case, your finding him has given us a unique opportunity. We've been building a case against Vega for years, but his operation is mobile and secretive. We need hard evidence linking him directly to these fights." Jack's guard went up immediately. "What does that have to do with Ghost?" "We have intelligence suggesting Vega is personally coming to inspect a new fighting venue. This would be the first time in 3 years he's been directly present at an operation." Reeves leaned forward. "We need to draw him out." "You want to use Ghost as bait," Jack stated flatly, anger rising in his throat. "Not exactly," Reeves countered. "We want to spread word that the horse survived, that it's been seen in the area. Vega's ego won't allow his prized fighter to remain free, especially one that killed his handler. He'll send people to investigate, people we can follow back to him." "You already tried that," Jack pointed out. "Those 3 thugs showed up at my place and you arrested them. Did they lead you to Vega?" "No." Sam sighed. "They were just hired muscle, Jack. They don't have direct contact with Vega. We need someone higher in the organization." Jack stood abruptly, pacing the small office. "So you'll keep using Ghost to lure increasingly dangerous people to my property until you get lucky. What happens when they come armed next time? What happens to Ghost if they manage to take him?" "We wouldn't let it come to that," Reeves assured him. "We'd have surveillance, undercover agents." "No," Jack interrupted. "Ghost isn't a tool for your investigation. He's been through enough." Reeves exchanged glances with Sam. "Mr. Reynolds, I understand your attachment to the animal, but this is bigger than one horse. This operation has been responsible for the torture and death of hundreds of animals across multiple states. Then find another way to stop it, Jack insisted. Ghost stays out of it. A tense silence filled the office. Finally, Sam spoke. There's something else you should know, Jack. Agent Reeves has been in contact with the Bureau of Land Management. Jack's stomach dropped. Why? Because technically, Ghost is a wild horse on federal land, Reeves explained. Under normal circumstances, he would fall under BLM jurisdiction. The implication was clear. If Jack didn't cooperate, Ghost could be legally removed from his care. The thought of Ghost being taken away, processed through bureaucratic channels, perhaps ending up in a government holding facility or worse, sent a chill through him. That's a threat, Jack said quietly. It's the reality of the situation, Reeves corrected. But I'm authorized to ensure BLM takes no action regarding this horse if you cooperate with our investigation. Jack felt trapped, the walls of the small office suddenly claustrophobic. It reminded him too much of negotiations under duress, situations where all choices were bad ones. I need to think, he finally said. Sam nodded, understanding in his eyes. Take the day. But Jack, this might be our only shot at Vega. The drive back to his property was a blur, Jack's mind replaying the conversation, searching for alternatives that didn't exist. When he arrived home, Ghost was waiting near the gate, as if sensing Jack's distress. Jack approached slowly, the familiar ritual of their interaction now second nature. Ghost allowed him to come within arm's reach, dark eyes watching intently. They want to use you, Jack told him, knowing the horse couldn't understand the words, but hoping somehow he might sense the meaning. To catch the men who hurt you, who would hurt more like you. Ghost's ears flicked forward, catching the emotion in Jack's voice, if not the content of his speech. I don't want you in danger again, Jack continued, carefully extending his hand. Ghost held still, allowing Jack's fingers to brush his neck, a trust that had been hard-won through patience and respect. But I don't know if I can protect you from the government any better than I could protect you from Vega's men. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the property, Jack made his decision. He couldn't put Ghost at risk again, not even to take down the organization that had tortured him. But he also couldn't simply stand by while others suffered the same fate. There had to be another way, a solution that didn't require sacrificing Ghost's safety or freedom. Jack called Sam just before midnight, his voice resolute. I have an alternative plan. Tell Agent Reeves to meet us tomorrow morning at my place. The next day dawned clear and cool, Montana's autumn announcing itself with a crispness in the air and the first hints of gold in the aspen leaves. Jack stood on his porch watching Ghost graze peacefully as two vehicles approached, Sam's cruiser followed by an unmarked SUV that Jack assumed contained Agent Reeves. You said you had another way, Sam greeted him, climbing out of his vehicle. Reeves emerged from the SUV, her expression professionally neutral but eyes alert with interest. I'll help you catch Vega, Jack stated flatly, but Ghost stays out of it completely. Reeves crossed her arms. Mr. Reynolds, I understand your concern, but I'm not finished, Jack interrupted. You need bait? Use me. Both Sam and Reeves fell silent, studying him with surprise. I was Special Forces, Jack continued. 3 tours, specialized in deep reconnaissance and intelligence gathering. Before I got captured, my team was known for infiltration operations. He gestured toward the distant mountains. I know these backcountry areas better than anyone in the county. I can get into Vega's operation. Absolutely not, Sam protested. Jack, this isn't Afghanistan. You're not military anymore. You're a civilian. Actually, Reeves interjected, her calculating gaze fixed on Jack. We've used civilian consultants with military backgrounds before. usually in advisory capacities, not field operations, but she trailed off, clearly considering the possibility. "It's too dangerous," Sam insisted. "More dangerous than using an abused animal as bait?" Jack countered. "I'm volunteering. Ghost isn't." Reeves regarded Jack thoughtfully. "What exactly are you proposing?" "Spread the word that someone who found a white stallion is looking to sell it back to its original owner. No questions asked. I'll pose as a local who needs money and doesn't care where it comes from. Vega's people will make contact. When they do, I'll gather the evidence you need to connect them directly to Vega." "And Ghost?" Reeves asked. "Stays hidden on a friend's property until this is over," Jack replied. "Sarah Chen, the vet who's been treating him, has a secure facility about 50 miles from here." Reeves and Sam exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. "It could work," Reeves finally admitted, "but you'd need a credible story, wire equipment backup." "So provide it," Jack said simply. "You were willing to risk Ghost for this operation. Are you willing to accept help from someone who actually wants to participate?" After several hours of discussion, planning, and argument, a strategy emerged. Jack would pose as a ranch hand who had found the white stallion and recognized its potential value. Sarah agreed to temporarily relocate Ghost to her property, where he'd be safe and continue receiving treatment. The FBI would provide Jack with surveillance equipment and a convincing cover identity. 2 days later, Ghost was safely hidden at Sarah's facility, and the word began spreading through carefully selected channels that Jack had information about a valuable white stallion. The waiting game began. It took less than a week for the first contact to come, a seemingly casual conversation at the local feed store that Jack recognized immediately as a probing interaction. 2 days after that, a man in expensive boots approached him outside the town's only bar, speaking in vague terms about mutual business opportunities. Jack played his role perfectly, the skills that had once kept him alive behind enemy lines now serving him in this new mission. He projected the right blend of greed and wariness, revealing just enough information to prove he had what they wanted without appearing too eager. After 3 meetings with increasingly senior members of Vega's organization, Jack finally received the call they'd been waiting for. A meeting had been arranged at an isolated hunting cabin 30 miles into the mountains. The man on the phone implied that the boss himself would be present to verify the horse's identity before any money changed hands. The night before the operation, Jack drove to Sarah's facility to check on Ghost. The stallion had continued to improve under her care, his coat regaining its luster, the worst of his wounds now fully healed. When Jack entered the paddock, Ghost approached him directly, no hesitation or fear, a transformation that still amazed him every time. "I'm taking care of the people who hurt you," Jack told him quietly, stroking the strong white neck. "So they can't do it to anyone else." Ghost pressed his muzzle against Jack's shoulder, a gesture that had become familiar between them. In these quiet moments, Jack sometimes felt the horse understood more than seemed possible, not the words, but the intention, the protection, the promise of safety. The next morning, Jack drove up the remote logging road toward the meeting point, his truck equipped with hidden cameras and his jacket concealing a wire. FBI teams were positioned strategically throughout the area, ready to move on his signal. Everything went according to plan until it didn't. Jack recognized Vega immediately from the photographs, a sharp-featured man with cold eyes who examined Jack with the calculating gaze of a predator. The verification questions began as expected, detailed inquiries about the white stallion's markings that only someone familiar with El Fantasma would know. Then something shifted in Vega's expression. "You seem very knowledgeable about this horse for someone who just found it," he observed, his voice dangerously soft. Jack maintained his cover, but he could feel the atmosphere in the cabin changing, the armed men around Vega shifting positions subtly, Something had tipped them off, a detail Jack had missed perhaps, or information they'd received. When one of Vega's men moved toward the door, blocking the exit, Jack realized the operation had been compromised. He had seconds to decide. The signal to the FBI teams was supposed to be a specific phrase. Instead, Jack simply said, "Now." What followed was chaos. FBI agents storming the cabin, shouting commands, Vega's men reaching for weapons. Jack tackled Vega himself, taking him to the ground as gunfire erupted around them. Something hot grazed Jack's arm, but adrenaline kept him focused on restraining the man beneath him. When it was over, Vega and 3 of his lieutenants were in custody. 2 others hadn't survived the shootout. Jack sat on the cabin steps, a medic bandaging his arm as Reeves approached. "You were made somehow," she said, "but we got him. And the evidence in this cabin connects him directly to the fighting operation. This is over." "Not for the animals, it isn't," Jack replied. "No," Reeves agreed soberly, "but it's a start." 3 weeks later, Jack stood in his pasture watching Ghost run. The stallion moved with growing confidence despite his permanently damaged leg, his white coat gleaming in the autumn sunlight. With Vega's operation dismantled and charges filed, the BLM had made an unusual exception. Ghost would remain classified as a wild horse, but was officially placed under Jack's care as a sanctuary arrangement. Ghost slowed to a trot, then approached Jack with the easy familiarity that now characterized their relationship. Jack extended his hand, and Ghost pressed his muzzle into the palm without hesitation. 2 survivors, Jack thought, both scarred, both once captive, both now finding a fragile freedom together. "We made it, Ghost," he said quietly. "We both made it."